Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 1st of May 2021. Today's session will be co-presented by Basava sir and me. The articles which we are going to discuss today have been displayed on the screen, and let us now begin the discussion with an important announcement. And that announcement is that the first batch of Quality Improvement Program classes or QIP classes is set to begin on Monday. QIP classes are designed in such a way that they deliver the most important topics for the prelims examination of that year in around 50 hours. These classes will consist of economy, environment, polity, history, science and tech, and international relations. The next batch of QIP classes is set to begin on 3rd of May 2021. Let us now begin the discussion.
The first article in today's newspaper appears from page number 5. The article is titled as High Court orders the centre to include remdesivir injections in the list of scheduled drugs and to regulate their pricing. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of Indian economy. From this particular article, one should be aware about two important aspects. One, as to how the prices of various pharmaceutical drugs and medicines is fixed in India. And second, about the exceptions for patents provided under the TRIPS agreement. So before discussing this particular article in much greater detail, let us first look into its background. As you all must be aware, there is an acute shortage of remdesivir injections in the Indian domestic market. As you can see here, the remdesivir injections are manufactured by multiple companies in the Indian domestic market. The average prices of the remdesivir injections range from rupees 2,800 to rupees 5,400 on an average basis. However, there is huge amount of black marketing and hoarding which is taking place. On account of these reasons, the average prices of the remdesivir injections has increased by almost around 6 to 8 times in the black market. Now, if you have to control the rising prices of the remdesivir injections, we basically have two options. Option number 1 is to issue a compulsory licensing under the TRIPS agreement. We have already done this before for the Nexavar drug, which was earlier manufactured by the German-based company known as Bayer. So we can probably issue a compulsory licensing even for remdesivir injection. And the second option is to regulate the prices of remdesivir under the Drug Price Control Order 2013. Under the Drug Price Control Order 2013, we usually come up with the national list of essential medicines. So all the medicines which are part of this particular list, their prices are in turn regulated by the government of India. So we can include remdesivir in the national list of essential medicines and then we can regulate its prices. In this regard, recently a PIL was filed before the Bombay High Court, wherein this particular PIL called upon the Bombay High Court to issue directions to the centre to regulate the prices of remdesivir. In this regard, the Bombay High Court has recently issued an order to the centre to include remdesivir in the list of scheduled drugs and to regulate their prices. So far, the central government has not taken any decision in this particular regard. Hence, as part of this particular news article, first and foremost, we'll understand the pharmaceutical pricing regime in India. And secondly, we'll look at various kind of exceptions provided for patents under the TRIPS agreement. By the end of this particular analysis of the article, you should be in a position to answer some of the prelims-based questions for the practice. So far in this particular article, I have chosen 5 prelims-based questions for the practice. Out of these questions, I will be discussing answers to at least 2 to 3 questions. So let us start our analysis with respect to the pharmaceutical pricing policy regime in India. Under the Essential Commodities Act 1955, the central government has been empowered to declare some of the commodities as essential commodities. So whenever the central government believes that there is acute shortage of any commodity on account of black marketing or hoarding, or the central government believes that there is an undue price rise which can adversely impact the consumers, in that particular case, the central government can declare any commodities as essential commodity. Please do understand here, the power to declare a commodity as essential commodity, this power is vested with the central government. This power is not vested with the state government. Usually, the central government has to consult the state government before declaring a commodity as essential commodity. So once a commodity is declared as essential commodity, the central government can then regulate its prices. Some of the commodities which are presently included under the Essential Commodities Act 1955 include the pharmaceutical drugs, fertilizers, agriculture commodities, petroleum products, and so on. In pursuance of the powers vested with the central government under this particular act, the central government has come up with the Drug Price Control Order 2013 in order to fix the prices of some of the essential medicines in India. This power to fix the prices of essential medicines is vested with the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority. Please do note here that the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority, it is not a statutory body. Rather, it has been set up through a government resolution and it functions under the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers. So this authority does not function under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Rather, it functions under the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers. In order to advise the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority as to which all drugs prices should be fixed, we do have the Standing Committee on Affordable Medicines and Health Products, which functions under the Niti Aayog. So this basically recommends the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority as to which all drugs prices should be controlled in case of India. Now all the medicines or drugs whose prices are directly fixed by the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority, all of these medicines are in turn considered to be the scheduled drugs. So scheduled drugs basically means that these drugs are included under the first schedule of the Drug Price Control Order 2013. All of these drugs are part of the national list of essential medicines. If you go to the updated national list of essential medicines, it has approximately around 680 scheduled formulations whose prices are effectively controlled by NPPA. Apart from fixing the prices of essential medicines, NPPA has also fixed the maximum prices of some of the medical devices such as the cardiac stents, knee implants, etc. Apart from controlling the prices of scheduled drugs, the NPPA also controls the prices of non-scheduled drugs. The non-scheduled drugs are basically those drugs which are outside the list of national list of essential medicines. So even the prices of these non-scheduled drugs are also controlled by NPPA. NPPA ensures that the prices of non-scheduled drugs should not increase by more than 10% on an annual basis. So while the prices of scheduled drugs are directly fixed by NPPA, NPPA ensures that the prices of non-scheduled drugs should not increase by more than 10% on an annual basis. Now the question is, how are the prices of scheduled drugs fixed by the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority? In order to understand this particular mechanism, let us look at an example. Now let's say you have a particular drug whose price needs to be fixed. Now let's say that this particular drug is manufactured by different companies under the different brand names. Let's say it has 4 different brand names of brand A, B, C and D. So in order to fix a maximum price for this particular drug, first and foremost, we would take into account all the brands of this particular drug whose market share is greater than 1%. So as you can see, the market share of brand D is 0.5%. So we will not take brand D into account. we will take into account only brand A, B and C. Once we take into account these three brands whose market share is greater than 1%, we will then calculate the simple average prices of these three brands. So if you try to calculate the simple average, it will be 90 plus 100, that is 190 plus 110, that is 300, 300 divided by 3. So this would be like rupees 100. So what we have done here is we have calculated the simple average of all the brands of this particular drug whose market share is greater than 1%. And in this particular case, it has come out to be at rupees 100. Now this happens to be the maximum price at which a wholesaler can sell this particular drug to a retailer. Now once the retailer buys this particular drug from a wholesale trader, the retailer would obviously sell this particular drug to a consumer. Now the maximum amount of margin to the retailer should be at 16%. So this particular margin cannot be more than 16%. So the maximum profit for the retailer on the scheduled drug cannot exceed 16%. So in this particular case, the consumer should get this particular scheduled drug at a minimum price of rupees 116. So the wholesaler would sell the scheduled drug to a retailer at rupees 100. The retailer would have a margin of rupees 16, and ultimately the consumer would get this particular medicine at rupees 116. The retailer cannot sell this medicine to the consumer at a rate above rupees 116. So this is how the prices of essential medicines is fixed by the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority. Apart from that, the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority has certain exceptional powers under the paragraph 19 of the Drug Price Control Order 2013. So what are these exceptional powers? First and foremost, the NPPA can even fix the prices of drugs which are outside the national list of essential medicines. So as discussed before, for those drugs which are outside the national list of essential medicines, that is the non-scheduled drugs, NPPA usually ensures that their prices should not increase by more than 10% on an annual basis. But at the same time, under certain exceptional circumstances, the NPPA can also fix the prices of these non-scheduled drugs. Secondly, NPPA has also been vested with the power to either increase or decrease the prices of drugs which are covered under the national list of essential medicines. Now, why this becomes important is because recently in the year 2020-21, the NPPA has used this particular exceptional power in order to increase the prices of some of the essential drugs such as the BCG vaccine, the anti-malaria drug chloroquine, vitamin C and so on. So usually NPPA reduces the prices of drugs which are part of the national list of essential medicines. But in the year 2020-21, the NPPA had decided to increase the prices of some of the essential medicines which are part of the scheduled drugs list. Apart from that, in the year 2019-20, the government had made some important amendments to the Drug Price Control Order 2013, which becomes quite important for your upcoming prelims examination. The first amendment was that the drugs which are patented under the Indian law, they would be exempted from the price control for the next 5 years. What this means is, if a particular drug gets patented in India, in that particular case, for next 5 years, the Indian government would not bring such a drug under the national list of essential medicines. So this is an amendment which has been done to the Drug Price Control Order 2013. Second is, drugs for treating the orphan diseases would also be exempted from the price controls. Now, what exactly are orphan diseases? Orphan diseases are basically those diseases which affect less number of population in a particular country. So since these diseases affect less number of people in a particular country, there is less incentives on the pharmaceutical companies to develop drugs for those orphan diseases. Obviously, because if they develop a drug for these orphan diseases, the amount of profits the pharmaceutical companies can make is quite lower. That is why they have less incentives to invest in research and development to develop drugs to treat the orphan diseases. Hence, in order to incentivize greater amount of investment in research and development for such drugs, countries such as European Union give for an extended patent duration of more than 20 years for the drugs which are used to treat the orphan diseases. Now, for example, you have a drug known as the rituximab. Now, this particular drug is used to treat some of the orphan diseases such as the autoimmune diseases. Now, in order to incentivize greater amount of research and development to develop drugs to treat the orphan diseases, the government has said that if a particular pharmaceutical company comes out with a drug to treat the orphan diseases, then the government would not bring such a drug under the national list of essential medicines. Now, these are some of the important aspects which one needs to know with respect to the pharmaceutical pricing policy regime in India. Now, based upon our discussion, I am pretty sure that most of you would be able to correctly find out the answers to these three prelims-based questions for the practice. Please do let us know the correct answers to these three prelims-based questions in the comments section. Let us now look at some of the exceptions to the patents under the TRIPS agreement. These exceptions are compulsory licensing, parallel imports, and Bolar exception. So let's understand this one by one, starting with compulsory licensing. See, the topic of compulsory licensing was recently discussed in our DNS. Under the compulsory licensing, if a government of a particular country believes that the cost of a life-saving patented drug is extremely costly and unaffordable to the poor people, in that particular case, the government can authorize a third party to manufacture and sell the patented drug without the permission of the patent owner. Now, for example, we do have a drug known as Nexavar, which is usually used to treat the kidney cancer. This Nexavar was manufactured and patented by a German-based company known as Bayer. So, since Bayer had exclusive monopoly to manufacture Nexavar, the monthly dosage of Nexavar in the Indian domestic market was extremely costly. This used to cost almost around rupees 2.8 lakh per month. So, since it was costly and since it was unaffordable to most of the sections of the Indian society, the government issued the compulsory licensing to a domestic company known as Natco Pharma. The Natco Pharma was asked to manufacture and sell Nexavar at a much lower cost at rupees 8,800 per month. So you can understand the significance of the compulsory licensing. So if you look at the prelims MCQ number 4, the first statement which is given here is correct. The second statement is the drugs for which the compulsory licensing have been issued can be exported to other countries. See, the World Trade Organization itself provides that if a particular country issues a compulsory licensing for a patented drug, then ideally such a member country should use the drugs for its own domestic market. But at the same time, under certain exceptional circumstances, the country can also export these drugs to the other countries. Now, for example, in case of India, we have issued the compulsory licensing, and by issuing the compulsory licensing, we were able to reduce the prices of the Nexavar drug. Now, just imagine this from the perspective of a least developed country. The least developed country can obviously issue a compulsory licensing, but the question is, does a least developed country has a requisite manufacturing capability to manufacture such a patented drug? In some of the cases, a least developed country may not have the manufacturing capability to manufacture a patented drug. So even though the least developed country may have a power to issue compulsory licensing, it may not have sufficient manufacturing capability to manufacture a patented drug. In that particular case, India can export a patented drug to such a least developed country. So the World Trade Organization has come up with the elaborate rules and regulations which actually provide for the compulsory licensing drugs to be exported to the other countries. So the statement which is given here is correct. The third statement is the TRIPS agreement provides for the payment of compensation to the patent holder on issuance of the compulsory licensing. The TRIPS agreement undoubtedly provides that whenever a compulsory licensing is issued, the patent holder needs to be compensated. However, the TRIPS agreement has not clearly laid out as to what should be the amount of compensation. So the statement which is given here is correct. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question should be D, 1, 2 and 3. The second exemption which I said under the TRIPS agreement is parallel imports. See, under the parallel imports, a particular member country can import a patented drug from another country where it is sold at a cheaper price. Now, for example, let's say in a particular country X, a patented drug is sold at $100. But in another country, it is being sold at say $10. In that particular case, this particular country X can exercise the option of parallel imports and decide to import this patented drug at $10 from another country. So this is the second exception provided under the TRIPS agreement. The third exception is the Bolar exception. So let's understand as to what exactly is this Bolar exception. See, a particular pharmaceutical company needs to carry out the clinical trial of a particular drug before releasing the drug in the market. So usually the pharmaceutical companies carry out the clinical trials of the drugs in order to understand the safety and efficacy of a particular drug, and this is considered to be extremely time consuming. On an average, it may take around 4 to 5 years. Now, based upon the results of the clinical trials, the regulator would then give an approval. Now, based upon the approval, the pharmaceutical companies would then release the drugs in the market. So let's understand as to what would happen in case of a generic drug, which is basically manufactured by a pharma company. Usually, patents, once they are issued, they get expired after a period of 20 years. So once the patent gets expired, the Indian pharmaceutical companies would be required to carry out the clinical trials of these drugs, which usually may take almost around 4 to 5 years, and based upon that, they need to take an approval from the regulators. So this can lead to huge delay in releasing the generic medicines in the Indian domestic market. Now, for example, the patent for a particular drug can get expired in the year 2020. But because of this time-consuming process of clinical trials and regulatory approval, the generic drug for this particular patented drug can be made available in the Indian domestic market only in the year say 2025 to 2030. So there is a time gap of 5 to 6 years before the generic version of the patented drug is made available in the Indian market. Hence, in order to avoid this particular problem faced by developing countries, we do have a concept of Bolar exception. Under the Bolar exception, this Indian pharmaceutical company can use the patented drug to carry out the clinical trials even before the expiry of this particular patent, which means in this particular case, the Indian pharmaceutical company can use this particular patented drug to carry out the clinical trial right from the year 2015. That is much before its patent gets expired. So by the time the patent gets expired in the year 2020, the Indian pharmaceutical company would have already carried out the clinical trial. It would have already taken the approval from the regulator. So as soon as the patent gets expired in the year 2020, the Indian pharmaceutical company would be in a position to release the generic version of this particular patented drug. So basically, the Bolar exception enables the pharmaceutical companies to use the patented drug in order to carry out the research and development as well as clinical trials. So the right answer to this particular question is A. So these are some of the important aspects which you need to know as far as the pharmaceutical pricing regime in India and exceptions for patents under the TRIPS agreement is concerned. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 14. The article is titled as April GST collections may go up to rupees 1.2 lakh crores. The GST Council is set to publish the monthly GST collections for the month of April 2021. and according to various media reports, this is expected to go up to rupees 1.2 lakh crores. See, the overall GST collections in the financial year 2020-21 had declined on account of the economic slowdown. But in the last 6 months, the monthly GST collections have consistently been more than rupees 1 lakh crores. Hence, the recent improvement in the GST collections is a positive development which has taken place in the Indian economy. The very fact that the GST collections have been improving highlights that the Indian economy is slowly recovering from the economic slowdown. Now, this particular topic of GST collection becomes quite important both from the perspective of prelims as well as mains. As far as the prelims examination is concerned, one should be aware about the trends in GST collection, GST council, and the GST compensation cess, which was recently in news. As far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be in a position to carry out the critical analysis of GST. That means in what way the GST has benefited the Indian economy, what are its constraints and challenges. So based upon the requirement of the UPSC prelims and mains examination, we will be discussing certain prelims based question for the practice. We will also be discussing a mains based question for the practice, and we will look into certain prelims pointers related to the GST collection. See, in the field of taxation, we do have a concept of revenue neutrality. Revenue neutrality basically means that when a new taxation regime replaces the old taxation regime, in that particular case, the overall revenue collected under the new taxation regime, this should be equal to the revenue collected under the old taxation regime. In other words, under the concept of revenue neutrality, when a new tax regime is introduced, this should not lead to the decrease in the tax revenue. See, as far as the GST is concerned, the GST has subsumed a number of indirect taxes such as the excise duty, central sales tax, service tax, value added tax, and so on. So, revenue neutrality in the field of GST would mean that whatever GST revenue which we are earning now, that should be equal to the revenue which we were earning through the taxes which are presently subsumed under the GST. Now, for example, according to the 15th Finance Commission's report, the amount of revenue which we were earning through the indirect taxes which are presently under the GST, this was almost like 6.3% of India's GDP in the year 2016-17. So this basically included all the indirect taxes which have got subsumed under the GST. So this was the total amount of tax revenue which we were earning before the introduction of GST. But once we introduce the GST, the overall revenue collection under the GST is now 5.7% of India's GDP in the year 2018-19 and 5.6% in the year 2019-20. But prior to the introduction of GST, it was like 6.3%. Now, this clearly means that there is lack of revenue neutrality as far as GST is concerned. So whatever revenue which we were earning before the introduction of GST, this was much higher as compared to the revenue which we are earning presently. Now, this particular problem in the GST collection has explicitly been highlighted by the 15th Finance Commission in its second report. Secondly, if you look at the share of GST in the total tax collection, now this is a snapshot of the budget 21-22. As you can see, the overall tax to GDP ratio in the financial year 2021, this was 9.8% of India's GDP. As far as the share of direct and indirect taxes is concerned, the share of indirect taxes has surpassed the share of direct taxes for the first time in the last decade. So presently, please do note here that the share of indirect taxes is higher than the share of direct taxes. And among the share of different direct and indirect taxes, it is the GST that contributes for the highest share. This is followed by the income tax and corporate tax. Usually, corporate tax collection is higher than the income tax, but this year, the income tax collection is higher than the corporate tax. Further, among the GST itself, you have different components such as central GST, state GST, IGST, GST compensation cess, and so on. Among all of these components, the highest share is that of the integrated GST. One of the most significant and positive development with respect to GST is with respect to the improvement in the tax base. The number of registered taxpayers has increased from 1.08 crores in the year 2017 to 1.23 crores in the year 2020. One of the stated objectives of GST was to bring about the formalization of Indian economy by bringing more number of informal entities under the tax bracket. And this, to a large extent, has been successful on account of the GST regime. However, one of the biggest problems with respect to GST has been the stagnation in the tax revenue. As you can see in this particular chart here, for the first time, the monthly GST revenue crossed the threshold of rupees 1 lakh crore for the first time in April 2018. But since then, the overall GST revenue have remained stagnant. It is only in the last 6 months that the monthly GST collections have picked up and have remained consistently above rupees 1 lakh crores. The last aspect is with respect to the shortfall in the GST compensation fund. Prior to the introduction of GST, some of the state governments were apprehensive that once the GST regime is introduced, then they would see a decline in their tax revenue. Hence, in order to convince the states to come on board and adopt the GST regime, the central government provided for the GST compensation mechanism. The same has been incorporated in form of a parliamentary act known as the GST Compensation Cess Act. Under this particular act, the central government has promised that the overall GST collections of the state government would increase by 14% year on year. And whatever is a shortfall, that shortfall would be compensated from the GST compensation cess. So presently the government is imposing the GST compensation cess on some of the sin goods as well as luxury goods. Some of these sin goods include tobacco, BDs, etc. And some of the luxury goods include the high-end luxury cars. So the government is imposing the GST compensation cess on these goods. Whatever money the government collects, all that money goes into the GST compensation fund. And this particular fund is in turn used to compensate the states which face a loss in their tax revenue. Let's understand this particular mechanism through a simple example. Now let's say the government of Karnataka has earned a GST revenue of rupees 100 in the year 2019, and let's say the government of Maharashtra has earned a GST revenue of rupees 200 in the same year, that is 2019. Now, according to the promise given by the central government, the overall GST revenue for the government of Karnataka in the year 2020, this should increase to rupees 114. That is, it should increase by 14%. For the state of Maharashtra, this should increase by 14% to rupees 228. Now, let's say the government of Karnataka is able to collect only 110, and let's say the government of Maharashtra is able to collect only rupees 220. So in case of Karnataka, there is a shortfall of rupees 4, and in case of Maharashtra, there is shortfall of rupees 8. Now this shortfall is in turn compensated from the GST compensation fund. Now for the first 2 years of implementation of GST, we had surplus amount of money in the GST compensation fund. For the financial year 2017-18, we had surplus of 21,000 crores. In the next financial year, we had surplus of almost around 25,000 crores. But in the next 2 financial years, we had a shortfall in the GST compensation fund. For the financial year 2019-20, we had a shortfall of rupees 70,000 crores. And more importantly, in the financial year 2020-21, which was primarily affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, this shortfall had increased to almost around rupees 2.35 lakh crores. In fact, the 15th Finance Commission has highlighted that almost 21 states in India are still dependent upon the GST compensation fund for their revenue loss. Now, this clearly means that whatever promise the central government has given to the states that their revenue would increase by 14% year on year after the introduction of GST, this has not happened so far. That is why we are facing such a huge shortfall in the GST compensation fund. So since this was a new development that took place in the financial year 2021, and since this had created a lot of controversy as well as issues between the center and states, this topic of GST compensation mechanism becomes extremely important for your upcoming prelims examination. Let us now look at some of the problems and challenges in the GST regime. First and foremost is the stagnation of revenue, which we have already discussed. Second one is with respect to complexity in the GST regime. See, the idea of introduction of GST was to simplify the tax structure and make it easier for the people to pay the GST. So ideally, we should have brought down the number of tax rates. But unfortunately, after the introduction of GST, the number of tax rates have increased. So we have different tax rates under GST, which include 0.25% for the precious stones, 3% for gold, and other standard tax rates such as 5%, 12%, 18%, and 28%. So the multiplicity in the number of tax rates has in turn increased the complexity in the administration of the GST regime. Nextly, even today, some of the commodities are still outside the GST regime. These include the petroleum crude, petrol, high-speed diesel, natural gas, etc. The next problem is with respect to issues in refunds. As you must be aware, under the GST regime, the manufacturers are provided with the input tax credit, but there is huge delay in the GST refunds. Apart from that, the 15th Finance Commission has highlighted that in recent times, a number of industries have been involved in fraudulent practices of creating fake invoices in order to corner the input tax credit, and this in turn has caused huge loss to the government. The next one is with respect to the anti-profiteering framework. See, under the anti-profiteering mechanism, whenever the GST Council reduces the GST tax rates, the manufacturers should pass on this benefit of reduction in the GST tax rate by reducing the prices of the commodities. See, under the anti-profiteering mechanism, whenever the GST Council reduces the GST tax rates, ideally, the manufacturers of the commodities should pass on this particular benefit of reduction in the GST rates through a commensurate reduction in the prices of the commodities. So, if the GST rates are reduced by 5%, ideally the prices of commodities should also be reduced by 5%. If the manufacturers do not reduce the prices of commodities and if they continue to sell the commodities at the same price, then it will be considered as an illegal profiteering. Now, in order to check illegal profiteering by the manufacturers, we have set up the National Anti-Profiteering Authority. However, the National Anti-Profiteering Authority has failed to come up with the clear guidelines on the anti-profiteering mechanism. And the last problem is with respect to the shortfall in the GST compensation cess, which has already been discussed. So these are some of the most pressing challenges as well as problems with respect to GST regime in India. So if you look at the mains question for the practice, the question here is, do you think the GST has lived up to its expectations of being a game changer in formalizing the economy, improving the tax compliance, and transforming the indirect tax structure in India? Give arguments in support of your answer. So here you are basically required to take a call as to what extent the GST has been able to fulfill its stated role. So far we have discussed both positives as well as negatives associated with the GST, wherein we have discussed that one of the most important positives of the GST is with respect to the increase in number of registered taxpayers as well as the tax returns. In spite of this important development, we do have some of the important challenges and problems. So what should be your conclusion in this particular case? So has GST indeed lived up to its expectation of being a game changer? We can clearly come to a conclusion that GST is still a work in progress. So we need to address these constraints and challenges so that the GST can emerge as a game changer. So as you can see here, in your conclusion, you have avoided the two extremes of GST. That is, neither have you said that GST is indeed a game changer, and nor have you said that GST has been a complete failure. Rather, in your conclusion, you're basically saying that GST can indeed emerge as a game changer provided we address these constraints and challenges. So that is how you can approach answers to such questions in the UPSC mains examination. Let us now look at some of the prelims based questions for the practice. The question is, which among the following goods have been kept outside the purview of GST by the Indian Constitution? See, Article 269 Clause A of the Indian Constitution itself provides that alcohol for the human consumption will be outside the purview of the GST. So as per the Indian Constitution, it is the alcohol for human consumption which remains outside the purview of GST. As far as petroleum crude, natural gas, diesel, etc. is concerned, even these commodities are outside the purview of GST. But this is not as per the Indian Constitution. In fact, the GST Act itself provides that the GST Council may decide to bring these commodities under the ambit of GST at a later date. So if you look at the options which are given here, the right answer to this particular question would be A, that is one only. So according to Indian Constitution, it is only the alcohol for human consumption that remains outside the purview of GST. As far as other commodities are concerned, these commodities can be brought under the purview of GST by the GST Council. Coming to next practice question, with reference to GST Council, consider the following statements. The GST Council can make recommendation on the taxes to be subsumed under the GST. As we have discussed, this is correct. Second one is, the quorum required for GST Council meeting is 1/2 of the total members, that is 50% of the total members. Even this statement here is correct. Third one is, so far all the decisions of the GST Council have been taken through consensus without the need to vote. See, until the end of December 2020, most of the decisions by the GST Council were actually based on consensus. But recently the GST Council decided to vote in order to decide on a particular issue. So the statement which is given here is wrong. The fourth statement is, the Cabinet Secretary acts as a secretary to the GST Council. This statement here is also wrong because it is the Revenue Secretary who acts as a secretary to the GST Council. If you want to know the details of the GST Council, they have been incorporated in the PDF for your reference. So the answer to this particular question would be 1 and 2 only. Coming to next practice question, with reference to GST compensation fund, consider the following statements. The first statement is, the GST compensation is to be paid to the states if the GST revenue growth is less than 14% year on year. As I discussed, this statement here is correct. The second statement is, the unutilized funds in the GST compensation fund automatically gets transferred to the Consolidated Fund of India at the end of every financial year. See, as we discussed, whatever money the government collects through the imposition of GST compensation cess, all that money goes into GST compensation fund. At the end of the financial year, the GST Council may provide that 50% of this unutilized funds go to the center and remaining 50% of the funds be distributed among the states. So this has to be provided by the GST Council at the end of financial year, wherein 50% of the unutilized funds go to the center and 50% of the remaining unutilized funds are distributed among the respective state governments. So the statement which is given says that they are automatically transferred. So firstly, this is wrong. And secondly, it is not entirely transferred to the Consolidated Fund of India. Only 50% gets transferred to the Consolidated Fund of India and remaining 50% is distributed among the respective state governments. So the statement which is given here is wrong, and accordingly the right answer to this particular question is A, that is one only. With this, let us now take up the next article.
This next news appears on page number 13. Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan seek to erase cross-border tensions. So a ceasefire has been announced at the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan border after a day of intense border conflict fight between the two nation forces. Current conflict started when Tajik officials started installing cameras to monitor the water supply, and the people of Kyrgyzstan protested it basically. And so, because of this trouble, because of this issue which is brewing between the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, one of the important map locations, Tash, Koktash, has been thrown into the news. And so we will understand why it is important to look and memorize these map locations, because UPSC asks questions related to map locations, and especially those locations which were in news due to some conflict. And this is just a demonstration of 2018 prelims question, in which towns sometimes mentioned in news were mentioned on the left hand side and you had to match them with the country. So Aleppo of course belonged to Syria. Kirkuk is not in Yemen but in Iraq. Similarly, Mosul is not in Palestine but in Iraq, and Mazar-e-Sharif in fact is in Afghanistan. And so the right answer was B, 1 and 4. And for all those who have entered into preparation lately in 2019 and 20, let me tell you that all these locations, especially the three locations on top, had to do with the stronghold of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, or later just Islamic State or IAS. Whereas the fourth location had to do with the Taliban. And similarly, the map location of Koktash has come into news, and UPSC is not going to get into further details, but it will stick to the map location, and this is where the Koktash is located, basically on the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. The capital of Kyrgyzstan is Bishkek, whereas capital of Tajikistan is Dushanbe, and this particular Koktash location is located towards the western side of this country called Kyrgyzstan. This editorial on page number 6, The Rising Sun in India-Japan Relations, talks about newly elected Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Yoshihide Suga, and how he is treading the path which was decided or which was traded by the earlier Prime Minister, Mr. Shinzo Abe. And in this regard, this article goes on to discuss the India-Japan relationship, especially focusing on Indo-Pacific region, currently a cause of concern for both India and Japan because of rising influence of China in this particular region. Now, there is no need to tell you that this particular topic is extremely important from the perspective of GS Paper 2 under International Relations. Bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements involving India and or affecting India's interests forms a part of the syllabus. And in this regard, India-Japan relationship along with its important perspectives has already been discussed by Mangal sir in DNS dated 29th of August 2020. Now, this news was discussed with respect to Samvad dialogue which was conducted between India and Japan, which had three underlying pillars: partnership for peace, partnership for global action and partnership for prosperity. Now, under partnership for peace, we can clearly see that India and Japan have quite a convergence in this field, because our Act East policy combines totally and in sync with free and open Indo-Pacific strategy of Japan. Similarly, you can see that as far as Indo-Pacific region is concerned, we are collaborating as far as Quad platform is concerned, and on security cooperation, we have 2+2 dialogue, maritime domain awareness exercises, Malabar exercises and Minix exercises. Then as far as partnership for global action is concerned, you can see that India, Japan along with Germany and Brazil are collaborating with each other as a group of nations known as G4 on UNSC reforms. Then on non-proliferation and India's entry into NSG, Japan is totally on board and we are collaborating on various other matters as well. And as far as partnership for prosperity is concerned, we are together running projects in third-party countries, for example in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. Not just that, India and Japan have come together to propose an alternative to One Belt One Road in form of Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, and we are also collaborating on connectivity in Northeast East-West Economic Corridor as well. And so you can see that the convergence between India and Japan is not very narrow or limited to one of the dimensions, but it is quite a wide spectrum. And if you want to watch and understand these issues in detail, it is highly recommended that you go through this DNS done by Mangal sir on 29th of August 2020.
The next article appears on page number 14. Now, this particular article highlights that the index of 8 core industries has registered a growth rate of 6.8% in the month of March 2021. Now, this particular topic is quite important because, as you can see in previous year prelims, questions have been asked with respect to the index of 8 core industries and the index of industrial production. So we'll try to understand as to how these two indices are different. See, basically we use both index of industrial production as well as index of 8 core industries in order to measure the industrial performance in the Indian economy. Please do understand that these two indices are not used to measure the changes in the prices of industrial goods. Rather, these two indices are used to measure the changes in the volume of production of the industrial goods. The index of industrial production is published by the National Statistical Office, whereas the index of 8 core industries is published by the Office of Economic Advisor under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. The base year for these two indices is both 2011-12. See, when we measure the index of industrial production, we can measure it either in terms of sectors or in terms of various categories of goods. Under the sectoral classification, we take into account three sectors, that is manufacturing, mining and electricity, and the highest weightage is given to the manufacturing sector. Under the use-based classification, we measure the industrial performance in terms of the changes in the volume of different goods such as the primary goods, capital goods, infrastructure goods, intermediate goods, consumer durables and consumer non-durables. The highest weightage is given to the primary goods and the least weightage is given to the capital goods. With respect to the index of 8 core industries, the 8 core industries are coal, crude oil, natural gas, petroleum refinery products, fertilizers, steel, cement and electricity. Now these 8 industries are considered to be extremely critical for the overall industrial performance of an Indian economy. Accordingly, we do measure the performance of these 8 sectors of the Indian economy in order to broadly understand as to how our industries are basically performing. These 8 core industries in turn constitute almost around 40% of the index of industrial production. So because of this, there is a much greater correlation between these two indices. Under this index of 8 core industries, the highest weightage is given to the petroleum refinery production, whereas the lowest weightage is given to the fertilizer production. So these are some of the important aspects which one needs to know with respect to this particular article.